The story of human progress, power, and prosperity has always been tied to the mystery of why some countries succeed while others remain poor and trapped in misery. History shows us that while some nations flourish with innovation, wealth, and social development, others collapse into corruption, poverty, and chaos. This question has puzzled philosophers, historians, and economists for centuries. Why do nations with the same climate, same natural resources, and sometimes even the same people end up in completely different conditions? This is the central question that Daron Acemoglu and James A. Robinson explore in their famous book Why Nations Fail. The book provides not just an economic explanation but a political and historical journey into the roots of prosperity and poverty. The authors argue that it is not geography, culture, or ignorance that primarily decides the fate of nations. Instead, it is the quality of their political and economic institutions. Inclusive institutions bring growth, innovation, and fairness, while extractive institutions bring inequality, stagnation, and failure. The authors begin with an important example that illustrates their whole idea, the story of the city of Nogales, which is divided into two halves by the U.S.-Mexico border. On the north side of Nogales, in Arizona, people enjoy high living standards, healthcare, education, democracy, and law and order. On the south side of Nogales, in Sonora, people live with corruption, weak institutions, poor public services, and low income. Yet, both sides have the same geography, the same climate, and even share cultural similarities. So why the difference? The answer lies in the institutions. The United States built inclusive political institutions that allowed people to participate in decision-making, protected private property, and encouraged investment and innovation. Mexico, in contrast, historically developed extractive institutions where a small elite controlled resources, wealth, and power for their own benefit, leaving the majority of people poor. This striking example is the opening lens through which the entire book unfolds. The authors take us deep into history to prove their point. They argue that throughout time, geography and culture were often used as excuses to explain poverty. But these explanations fail when we look closely. For example, Africa is often described as poor because of its hot climate or tropical diseases, but this cannot explain everything. After all, Singapore also lies in a tropical region but has become one of the richest nations in the world. Similarly, the Middle East, once the cradle of civilization, is today struggling with authoritarian regimes and poor development despite having oil and other resources. Clearly, geography cannot explain the huge gap between rich and poor nations. Culture is also not the deciding factor. Some argue that Protestant or Western culture made Europe rich, while other regions lacked the work ethic or values that encourage growth. But history shows that culture changes rapidly with institutions. For example, Germany, Japan, and South Korea were once considered rigid, hierarchical societies, but once they adopted inclusive institutions, they became economic powerhouses. On the other hand, countries with similar cultural roots like North Korea and South Korea ended up on completely opposite paths because of differences in their institutions. North Korea created a closed, extractive system where innovation and freedom were suppressed, while South Korea built inclusive markets and democratic politics. The book then explores how institutions are shaped by history and how small events can create big differences in the long run. The authors use the example of the Glorious Revolution in England in 1688. This revolution limited the power of the monarchy and gave more authority to Parliament, creating stronger property rights and opening doors for merchants and innovators. These changes laid the foundation for the Industrial Revolution, which made Britain a global economic leader. In contrast, countries like Spain, despite their massive wealth from American colonies, failed to develop inclusive institutions. The Spanish crown and elites used extractive systems, exploiting colonies for gold and silver, but not building long-term innovation or inclusive growth. As a result, Spain declined economically while England rose. Another key example is the story of the Industrial Revolution itself. It was not just a matter of new machines or scientific discoveries. The real reason it happened in England and spread to Western Europe was because of inclusive institutions that rewarded innovation, allowed inventors to profit from their work, and protected the rights of entrepreneurs. If extractive elites had blocked innovation because it threatened their power, industrialization would never have taken root. Indeed, in many parts of the world, elites did exactly that. For instance, in Austria-Hungary and Russia, political elites actively suppressed industrialization because they feared that empowering the masses with new jobs and technologies would weaken their control. This leads to one of the book's most powerful ideas: the vicious and virtuous circles of institutions. When a country has extractive institutions, power and wealth concentrate in the hands of a few. These elites then use their control to strengthen the system in their favor, creating a vicious circle where inequality and poverty persist. On the other hand, inclusive institutions create a virtuous circle, where participation spreads, opportunities increase, and innovation grows, further strengthening inclusive systems. A good example is the United States, where democratic rights gradually expanded from white male property owners to include all citizens, creating stronger and more resilient institutions over time. In contrast, in many Latin American countries, elites resisted reforms and maintained extractive systems, which led to repeated cycles of dictatorship, inequality, and stagnation. The authors also give attention to critical junctures, historical moments that determine whether nations move toward inclusive or extractive institutions. For example, the Black Death in 14th century Europe killed a large part of the population, but the consequences were very different in different regions. In Western Europe, peasants were able to demand better wages and rights, weakening feudalism and leading to more inclusive institutions. In Eastern Europe, however, elites responded by tightening control over peasants, expanding serfdom, and making institutions more extractive. This shows how the same event can push societies in opposite directions depending on the balance of power between people and elites. The book provides numerous examples from around the world to make its point clearer. Consider the comparison between Botswana and Zimbabwe. After independence, Botswana built strong, inclusive institutions, respected property rights, and managed its diamond wealth wisely, turning itself into one of Africa's most successful economies. Zimbabwe, under Robert Mugabe, developed extractive institutions where the ruling elite captured wealth, undermined democracy, and destroyed economic opportunities, leading to hyperinflation and poverty. Similarly, Sierra Leone and other African nations fell into the trap of extractive institutions, where natural resources became a curse rather than a blessing. Instead of lifting people out of poverty, diamonds, oil, and other riches were captured by corrupt elites and fueled civil wars. A particularly striking case is North and South Korea. Both countries were part of the same nation with the same culture, language, and geography. But after the Korean War, the North created a dictatorship with centralized control and suppression of innovation, while the South developed inclusive institutions with global trade and democracy. Today, South Korea is one of the most advanced economies, while North Korea struggles with famine and isolation. This is perhaps the clearest modern-day proof of the author's argument. The book provides numerous examples from around the world to make its point clearer. Consider the comparison between Botswana and Zimbabwe. After independence, Botswana built strong, inclusive institutions, respected property rights, and managed its diamond wealth wisely, turning itself into one of Africa's most successful economies. Zimbabwe, under Robert Mugabe, developed extractive institutions where the ruling elite captured wealth, undermined democracy, and destroyed economic opportunities, leading to hyperinflation and poverty. Similarly, Sierra Leone and other African nations fell into the trap of extractive institutions, where natural resources became a curse rather than a blessing. Instead of lifting people out of poverty, diamonds, oil, and other riches were captured by corrupt elites and fueled civil wars. A particularly striking case is North and South Korea. Both countries were part of the same nation with the same culture, language, and geography. But after the Korean War, the North created a dictatorship with centralized control and suppression of innovation, while the South developed inclusive institutions with global trade and democracy. Today, South Korea is one of the most advanced economies, while North Korea struggles with famine and isolation. This is perhaps the clearest modern-day proof of the author's argument. The authors also explore how extractive institutions often collapse under their own weight. While they may bring short-term growth by mobilizing resources, they cannot sustain innovation. For example, the Soviet Union achieved rapid industrialization under an extractive system, but because it suppressed creativity and entrepreneurship, it eventually stagnated and collapsed. In contrast, countries with inclusive institutions like the United States continued to adapt and grow because they allowed creative destruction, the process where new innovations replace old ones. Although this process can be disruptive, it is essential for long-term progress. The book also challenges the idea that foreign aid can solve the problem of poverty in developing nations. The authors argue that unless aid changes the institutions of a country, it cannot bring real development. Too often, foreign aid is captured by corrupt elites and used to strengthen extractive systems rather than to empower the poor. Real change comes from internal struggles and movements that demand inclusive institutions, not from outside donations. In their conclusion, the authors remind us that the destiny of nations is not written in stone. Countries can change their paths if they reform their institutions. History provides examples of nations that broke free from extractive systems and built inclusive societies. However, such change is never easy because elites who benefit from the current system will resist reform. The fight for inclusive institutions requires courage, collective action, and sometimes even revolutions. To put the message in simple words, Why Nations Fail teaches us that nations succeed when they create rules that give equal opportunities to their people, protect their rights, and reward innovation. Nations fail when a small group captures all the power and wealth, leaving the rest of society excluded. Examples from around the world, from the success of South Korea, Botswana, and the United States to the struggles of North Korea, Zimbabwe, and Sierra Leone, make this lesson very clear. The book is not just about economics. It is about the deep connection between politics, history, and human choices. It shows that poverty is not inevitable and wealth is not accidental. Nations are poor or rich because of the systems they build, and those systems are shaped by the struggles of people against elites. The story of prosperity is, in the end, the story of freedom, fairness, and inclusion.